Chapter 10. Windmaster in White. Bellowing sandstorms from nowhere. Shi Lian unconsciously stepped forward to stand in front of San Lang. I know better than anyone where my place is, Shi Lian replied. Then how dare you still stand next to him? Fu Yao shouted. Because if I stand next to him, the snakes won't come? Shi Lian answered earnestly. Hearing the response, San Lang pfft and laughed out loud. Fu Yao grew grimmer. You! Grimmer and grimmer. His face suddenly turned completely black. It wasn't just his face, but Shi Lian's entire view was dimmed into darkness. The screen of flames and the ring of fire created by Fu Yao were suddenly completely extinguished. Within the darkness, Shi Lian heard San Lang snicker and say, "Useless trash." Then he felt San Lang grip his shoulders to pull him close. Soon after, Shi Lian heard a sudden downpour of endless battering above them, like a thunderstorm hitting an umbrella. Needless to say, now that the defense barrier was gone, the snake dolge came pouring down like mad. The open umbrella was blocking the downpour, and Shi Lian could smell the thick, foul stench of blood. He was about to fight, but San Lang stopped him. Don't move. No lowlifes will dare approach. His tone was confident. The first sentence was soft and gentle, the second arrogant. Shi Lian wasn't worried, but hearing Fu Yao's angry roars from across the pit, sounding like he was getting bombarded by snakes, he called out, "San Lang!" "No," San Lang instantly replied. Shi Lian didn't know whether to laugh or cry. "How did you know what I was going to say?" "Don't worry so much. He can't die," San Lang said. Just then another roar came from ahead of them in the pit. "Ban Yue, if you want me to die, have them bite me and kill me in one go! What the hell is this?" "It's not me!" Ban Yue cried. It seemed that Keimo had awoken from after the punch, discovered himself submerged in countless snakes, and believed it to be Ban Yue's doing. "Fu Yao, can you light another fire? Do it again!" Shi Lian shouted. Fu Yao gritted his teeth. "That cad next to you is restricting my powers. I can't light anything." Shi Lian felt dread, and San Lang said, "It's not me." "I know it's not you," Shi Lian said, "but that's precisely what's wrong. Both Ban Yue and Keimo are bound by the immortal binding rope, so they can't use their powers. My powers are depleted, and you're not restricting anyone. Meaning there's a sixth person in this pit." "Have you lost your mind?" Fu Yao demanded. "What sixth person? No one else came down." "Who's there?" Ban Yue suddenly said. "Ban Yue, what's happening? Is someone over there?" Shi Lian asked. "Someone—" Ban Yue's voice cut off. Whether her mouth was sealed shut, or she lost consciousness, they didn't know. Shi Lian called out again, "Ban Yue?" Fu Yao was still fighting snakes, and brief flashes of white light blasted in waves in the darkness. "Be careful, she might be tricking you." "Not necessarily," Shi Lian shouted. "I'm going to save her first." Shi Lian was about to run into the snake dolge when he heard San Lang's voice next to his ear. "All right." Shi Lian felt the hand gripping his shoulders tighten, and in a flash, they were dashing forward. Shi Lian realized in awe that the youth was advancing and attacking at the same time, but with an umbrella in one hand, and him in the other. In the darkness, silver shimmers flashed about once more, clanking and clinking, when suddenly the sharp sound of two swords clashing rang in everyone's ears. "Oh?" San Lang said. "There really is a sixth person. Interesting." Shi Lian had no idea how San Lang was controlling the weapon, or what kind of weapon it was, but whatever it was, it most certainly did clash head-to-head into another. His opponent remained silent, and Shi Lian could only hear metal scraping metal as the fight intensified. From time to time, there would be sparks flashing in the dark, but each flash was so short-lived it was hard to see the other's face. Shi Lian listened to the fight while calling out, "Ban Yue, are you still conscious? Can you respond?" No one responded. Fu Yao explained, "Maybe the one fighting now is her." "No, that's definitely not Ban Yue," Shi Lian said. While both times were in the dark, when San Lang fought Keimo, he was light-footed and messing about, toying with the man. This fight, however, Shi Lian could tell San Lang was taking more seriously. The opponent was extremely skilled in martial arts and weaponry. Ban Yue was small and weak. From the look of her limbs alone, it was obvious that strength and weaponry were not her forte, so it was impossible for her to be the one fighting San Lang. But who was this sixth person? When did they appear? Fu Yao griped. Someone who would betray her own country is no different from Shangji. Why on earth do you still believe in her? Fu Yao, can you not be so irritated all of a sudden? Shi Lian said. Wait, what did you just say? Fu Yao struck out another palm and blew away a bunch of snakes. I said, why on earth would you believe in her? Like you believe in that cat next to you. No, not that. You said Shangji. You mentioned Shangji's name, didn't you? Shi Lian said. Yes, so what? She's completely irrelevant. Shi Lian, however, held his breath. A moment later, he called out, Stop fighting! There's no more need to hide. I know who you are. The sounds of blades clashing never halted. The other was unmoved, but Shi Lian wasn't worried. Did you think I was bluffing when I said I already knew who you are? General Pei Jr. Who are you talking to? Fu Yao was dumbstruck. General Pei Jr.? Don't be crazy. Who do you think he is? If he descended, everyone would know. You're very right, Shi Lian said. But what if it wasn't his true self that descended? In the darkness, the fighting weapons faltered for a split second, then picked up anew. Shi Lian continued, It took me too long to figure this out. I should have known from the beginning. I knew that for close to 200 years there was something causing havoc, but none of the heavenly officials cared and no one dared to speak of it. So there had to be someone no one wanted to offend keeping this scandal under wraps. Since I wasn't familiar with many of the officials, I didn't dare boldly pin this on anyone, and never tried to boldly deduce which heavenly official it could be. It was Fu Yao's mention of Shangji that reminded him. It wasn't hard to connect the subject of Shangji to the two generals' pay, and the north was their territory. Fu Yao once said in passing that prior to his ascension, General Pei Jr. slaughtered a city. Which city? It could very well be the kingdom of Banyue. The upper court wouldn't bat an eyelash at something like this. Everyone needed to spill some blood if they wanted to do great things. But slaughtering a city wasn't anything glorious. After all, if the story were to spread too far, it would affect the number of new believers. So of course there would be some cover-ups after ascension. Thus, even if everyone knew something of the sort had happened, they probably didn't know the details, or didn't care to know. Besides, unless someone possessed some sort of deep grudge, who would have had the time or motivation to dig up his past and offend the support behind his back? Shi Lian spoke slowly. That mudface said there was someone among us who visited the city 50 or 60 years ago. At first I thought he was lying to deceive us into getting closer, but his words may very well have been true. Before, in that group of people, the one I was the most suspicious of was you. The caravan followed you, and you could take them anywhere. I had never seen a single scorpion snake in the years I had lived near Banyue. And now, while randomly seeking shelter from the sandstorm, they just happened to show up? I asked you to come search for the Shanyue firm with us, but just before we left, you gave the directions to the ruins to the others so they could follow in our footsteps, if they could no longer sit still. Earlier, on top of the walls, I already said that if anything were to happen, I would go forward first. You, who was always calm, suddenly jumped and died a meaningless death. Shi Lian continued after a pause. Your actions were strange and illogical at every turn. That it took me until now to realize who you are really is too late. Isn't that right, General Pei Jr.? Or should I call you your current name? Ah Xiao. Abruptly, everything became still. It was a moment before a frigid voice spoke. Did you not suspect that Mudface might have been talking about the red-clothed boy next to you? Just as he spoke, a stream of flames suddenly lit up across the sinner's pit. Under the light, two bloody silhouettes were revealed. One was Sanlang, dressed in red, standing properly with his weapon already tucked away. The other was a plainly clothed young man, with a sword tightly in hand, still brandished at the ready. The plain-clothed young man was covered in blood, looking like he was also dressed in red. His expression was cold and reserved, and he was carrying someone over his shoulders. It was indeed Ah Xiao. To be fair, whether it was General Pei himself or Ah Xiao, that composed, calm, and collected aura never changed. Only Shi Lian never thought in that direction, so he hadn't connected the two until now. The one he was carrying over his shoulders was Banyue. It seemed he had called forth the snakes in order to steal her away during the chaos. Now that his identity was revealed, he no longer needed to create havoc, and the snake dolge ceased its bombardment. He sheathed his sword and gently laid Banyue on the ground. On the side, Keimo was shocked. Who are you? Didn't you fall to your death? Ah Xiao didn't spare a look at Keimo. Instead, staring intently at Sanlong. Kamo, you really haven't changed in hundreds of years, he said simply in the Banyue tongue. Perhaps this maddeningly calm tone was overly familiar. Kamo's face immediately scrunched up in rage. It's you! Pei Shu! If not for the immortal binding rope solidly tying him down, Kamo would have lunged at him to fight to the death. General Pei Jr., Shilian said. Those scorpion snakes listened to more than one command, didn't they? You controlled all the snakes that Banyue said no longer obeyed her, and took them out to do harm, correct? And it was me. Did Banyue teach you how to control the scorpion snakes? Shilian questioned. She didn't, Pei Shu said, but I easily learned for myself how she does it. General Pei Jr. is exceedingly intelligent, after all, Shilian commented. After a pause, he then asked, when did you two meet? How did you two meet? Pei Shu, however, gave him a look. General Hua? Shilian was puzzled. Why are you calling me by that title, too? Pei Shu asked quietly, do you not recognize me, General Hua? Now Shilian did. The beginning was kind of blurry. Banyue was a girl bullied and ignored by other Banyue children when she was younger, and only a young boy of Yong'an would sometimes pay attention to her. Like Banyue, that boy didn't talk very much. Quite a number of children living on the border were from military families, and many also enlisted in the army when they grew older. Could it be... It's you? Shilian was surprised. I can't believe it took me this long to realize it was you. Pei Shu nodded. It's me. I've only just recognized the general, too. No wonder. So it turned out Banyue and the enemy general had already known each other since childhood. Did Banyue really need your help? Did Banyue really heed your order to open the city gates? Shilian asked. On the other side, Kamo spat and yelled, Despicable Pei Shu! Untie these ropes! Let me fight him to the death! Pei Shu said coolly, First of all, we already had a battle to the death 200 years ago, and you lost. Second of all, how am I despicable? Kamo exclaimed, How could we have lost if you two hadn't colluded? Kamo, don't deny it, Pei Shu said. Even though I only had a troop of 2,000, for me, breaking through the city gates was only a matter of time. Shilian couldn't help but interrupt. Wait a sec, you only had 2,000 under you? And you were sent to invade a country? Why was that? Isn't that no different from sending you to your death? Were you, perhaps, even more elbowed out in the army than I was? Pei Shu stopped talking. It seemed Shilian had hit it on the head. Shilian then asked, If you knew it was a sure win, why did you have Banyue open the city gates? Because I needed to slaughter the city, Pei Shu replied. What do you mean? Shilian asked. Since you were already going to win, why did you have to slaughter the city? It couldn't be his hobby. It was precisely because victory was at hand that we had to wipe out the city, Pei Shu said, and it had to be as soon as possible, immediately, leaving none behind. That leaving none behind sounded ghastly. Shilian pushed. And the reason was? Pei Shu answered. On the night before the invasion, many of the leaders of Banyue's major clans gathered for a meeting and decided on a secret plot. What plot? The people of Banyue were fierce in nature and hated Yong'an to the core, Pei Shu said. Even knowing they were about to be defeated, they wouldn't submit. So the entire population of the kingdom, the young and the old, the women and the men, all banded together to assemble something. What was that something? Shilian could guess, but he wasn't sure. The word that came out of Pei Shu's mouth confirmed his suspicions. Explosives. Pei Shu slowly enunciated each word. They decided that if the kingdom was to fall, the citizens would all carry explosives on their bodies, escape to Yong'an, mix into large, crowded areas, and blow themselves up to cause riots. Meaning, if they had to die, then they would drag as many Yong'an people down with them as they could. If the kingdom should fall, then they would terrorize the country that brought their downfall. Which was why they had to be annihilated before the civilians had time to flee. Shilian instantly turned to Kamo, roughly summarized for him in the Banyue language, and asked, Is this true? Kamo looked dauntless and made no attempt to conceal the facts. It's true. Sanlang quirked his brow at this and commented, "How vile." He said those words in the Banyue tongue, but though whether it was intentional was unknown. Kamo replied angrily, "Vile? What right do you have to call us vile? If it wasn't for your assaults, we wouldn't have been forced to make that move. You ruined us, so we sought revenge. How is that wrong?" Pei Shu responded, "Really now. How about we lay everything out in the open, then? How many times did Banyue citizens start riots near the border? How many caravans and travelers going to the western regions from Yong'an were ambushed by Banyue? You intentionally slaughtered the bandits that terrorized Yong'an and killed our soldiers sent to exterminate them under the pretense of illegal border crossing. How is that not vile?" Pei Shu spoke unhurriedly, and his tone was calm, but each word was as sharp as a knife. Kamo argued, "But it's because you forcibly occupied our land that we had no choice but to retaliate." "The border had always been ambiguous, so how can you say we forcibly occupied your land?" Pei Shu countered. "The lines were clearly drawn. It was you who didn't keep the agreements." "The lines were drawn by Banyue, and Yong'an never agreed to them. Your so-called drawn border was nothing but pushing us into the desert and keeping the oasis all for yourselves. How ridiculous." Kamo countered furiously, "The oasis was always ours. Our forefathers, generation after generation. The Banyue had always lived in the oasis." Both sides had their stories. Just listening to them argue befuddled Shilian. This hostility was making him remember how badly he got beaten up, stuck in between both sides, and he could feel the pain on his face resurface. Pei Shu seemed to have enough of quarreling with Kamo, and he turned to Shilian. "So you see, there are many things in the world that simply cannot be clearly defined or resolved. You can only fight." Shilian sighed. "I'll agree to the first part." Sanlang, on the other hand, said, "I'll agree to the second part." Kamo's anger was somewhat curbed, and he suddenly said, "The majority of Yong'an people were shameless, but you were the most shameless I'd ever met. Pei Shu, you're a cold-hearted man. You didn't kill us for your country, and it wasn't to save your people." Pei Shu fell silent at this. Kamo continued, "You were the son of an exiled man, looked down on by all. You only wanted to secure your footing in the Yong'an army and keep climbing up, so you had to win the battle. So sad that Banyue still thought you were good and let you use her and betrayed us for the likes of you." "But isn't General Pei Jr. a descendant of General Pei?" Shilian wondered. To have such a renowned ancestor watching over him, how could he have fallen so astray? "He's not a direct descendant of General Pei," Sanlang said. "He's from however many branches out." So that was it. That meant, had he not ascended, he probably wouldn't have had any chance of being blessed by the old ancestors. Pei Shu said quietly, "Banyue had always been my subordinate, and only infiltrated the kingdom of Banyue under my control. She is from both Banyue and Yong'an. Once she chose her side, she had to be loyal to that side, and there was no such thing as betrayal. The Banyue people were evil. I have no regrets about killing them." Suddenly, a voice came from above. "No regrets about killing? Well said! Will you say the same about all the travelers you misled to this pass, who lost their lives in this pit?" The voice had come from above everyone's heads, and Shilian instantly looked up. "Which great master is here among us?" There wasn't a response, but a sudden strange noise. Whoosh, whoosh. It was like the bellowing of wild winds. When that sound finally came near, Shilian could finally say with certainty, it definitely was the bellowing of wild winds. The abrupt gale entered the sinner's pit from above, swept all the way to the bottom, and rolled everyone into the air. Shilian immediately grabbed for Sanlang, who was the closest to him, and cried, "Watch out!" Sanlang caught him too, face unchanging. Shilian only felt a spinning whirl, their bodies swiftly rising, and after a pause they started plunging down. Shilian quickly tossed out Roya and coaxed in the midst of this chaos. All right, everything's over. Hurry, my good Roya. Come out and give us a hand." After a couple of pets, Roya finally flew out. However, with nothing in the air to grab onto, and a giant sinner's pit below, Roya flew around once before shrinking back. Feeling resigned, Shilian could only adjust his form for landing. If this was like previous incidents, he would have catered headfirst a meter into the ground. But this time, just before he hit the ground, Sanlang reached out and gave him a pull, and he actually landed with his feet on the ground. When his boots firmly touched down, he was even a little incredulous. But that feeling went away very quickly when a black-clad silhouette came stumbling before him. Shilian saw who it was and called out in delight, "Nanfeng!" It was Nanfeng indeed, but a disheveled Nanfeng. It looked as if he were rolled in dirt a dozen times before getting thrown into a rambunctious den of beasts to spend the night. His clothes were tattered and frayed, unkempt to the max. Hearing Shilian's call, he only waved quietly and wiped at his face, unable to even speak. Shilian helped him to his feet. "What happened? Did those two ladies beat you up?" Before he finished, two figures appeared behind Nanfeng and walked over. One of them was the female cultivator in white, with a whisk in her arms, and she greeted Shilian cheerfully. "How do you do, Your Royal Highness?" Although Shilian didn't know who this was, proper etiquette still must be followed. But he didn't know how to address her, so he could only smile back and wave. "Greetings, fellow cultivator." The lady in black, standing to the side, glanced coldly at Shilian, but didn't seem to care about him. When her eyes moved to Sanlang, however, she seemed to think he was a dubious figure, and stopped for a moment. And we have an illustration of them. The gusts earlier had blown everyone out of the pit, and the two ladies walked past Shilian, heading straight for Pei Shu. He saw them approach and didn't appear surprised. After all, he had already seen them in town when he was still playing the part of Ashao. He knelt where he was, bowed his head to the lady cultivator in white, and greeted her quietly. "Lord Windmaster." Shilian was stunned hearing those words, and here he thought she was some menacing ghost or monster. Who knew she was actually a heavenly official? And she was the Windmaster, the one who was giving out 10,000 merits in one go in the communication array. But now that he thought about it in detail, there wasn't anything out of place. At the time, she had said something along the lines of, "Now where did they go? Do I have to dig them out and kill them one by one?" and made him think that she was after them. In reality, this "they" might not have meant their group. She could have meant the Banyue soldiers. Shilian thought he was alone in this investigation, and thus, naturally, the lady cultivators were strange and wicked. Shilian couldn't help but feel a nameless reverence toward a heavenly official who could easily hand out 10,000 merits. He turned to Nanfeng. "Why didn't you tell me this was the Windmaster sooner? And here I thought she might be some sort of snake or scorpion spirit. Such impropriety." Nanfeng's expression darkened. "I didn't know it was the Windmaster. I've never seen the Windmaster like this before. The Windmaster has always been..." "Never mind." Shilian understood. This was a fake appearance the Lord Windmaster donned, so he didn't dig into it. He asked, "Why did the Windmaster come to Banyue Pass?" "To help out," Nanfeng said. "When we saw them strolling in the streets earlier, they were actually looking for those Banyue soldiers." Shilian recalled now the first time he asked about the Banyue Pass in the communication array. In the midst of the silent awkwardness, it was the Windmaster's sudden release of 10,000 merits that distracted everyone. The Windmaster had probably taken notice of his query then. As Shilian mused, the Windmaster crouched down in front of Pei Shu. "Little Pei, I've heard everything, you know." Pei Shu hung his head. The Windmaster demanded, "Do you admit for the past 200 years, you are the one who lured all those travelers into the ancient kingdom of Banyue?" Since he was already caught, Pei Shu didn't argue, and only replied solemnly, "It was me." "Why?" the Windmaster demanded. After a pause, Pei Shu asked, "Lord Windmaster has long been suspicious. Can you not guess why?" "Is it only because the souls of the dead are iron proof of the blood on your hands while you were a human, and would become obstacles to your climbing higher in the future?" the Windmaster asked. Pei Shu neither agreed nor disagreed. Shilian, who was listening from the side, couldn't help but ask, "If anything, why didn't you just kill them directly? Why instead was your method of feeding them the living to appease their resentment? How is that different from quenching the thirst of one by using another's flesh and blood?" Sanlang replied, "He couldn't." That was true too. In the upper court, every move by a heavenly official like Pei Shu was watched intently by countless eyes. There were many things he couldn't do directly. He couldn't use his true form to come down openly and kill off the resentful spirits of those soldiers, and he couldn't send troops to annihilate them either. This was already a concealed affair. If there was too much of a stir, wouldn't it attract everyone's gaze? At most, he could only send a clone, like Ashao, down separately. Using the scorpion snakes at Banyue was a known expert in manipulating to go out and cause harm, attracting passerby to feed the resentful spirits and disperse their resentment. It was no doubt murder by proxy. "Your General Pei wouldn't have ever done something like this," the Windmaster said. This time, I'm afraid you've crossed the line. The fact that he would release a clone to cause havoc in the Banue Pass for almost 200 years and lure in numerous passerby down the wrong path and into the ruins to die by the mouths of Banue soldiers. For a heavenly official, this was no small issue whatsoever. Pei Shu had his head bowed low. This junior knows. The Windmaster swept her whisk. As long as you understand. Reflect on yourself and think on it. We'll talk in the heavens. I understand, Pei Shu said quietly. Having finished talking with Pei Shu, the Windmaster stuffed the whisk back into the collar of her robe, stood up, and smiled at Shilian. Your Royal Highness the Crown Prince, I've heard much about you. To Shilian, I've heard much about you really wasn't a compliment, but nonetheless it was just meaningless pleasantries. So he smiled back. I'm sure it's nothing. I've heard much about you as well, Lord Windmaster. Sorry about before, by the way, the Windmaster said. Shilian paused. Before? What happened before? Didn't you all run into a windstorm in the desert? Thinking back, Shilian could almost taste the mouthfuls of sand. He replied, Yes? I started that, the Windmaster said. The Windmaster explained. That windstorm was meant to stop you all from going near the kingdom of Banue, but not only did you not get blown away, you went around and ended up in Banue anyway. The longer Shilian listened, the more he felt that something wasn't right. First, she used a windstorm to stop them from getting to Banue Pass, and now this whole thing was suddenly out in the open. What did it mean? Shilian didn't respond, biding his time to see what the other would say. The Windmaster then continued, But in regard to this whole ordeal, it would be best if your highness got no further involved. Shilian stole a look at Banue curled up on the ground and felt his dread rise. He was already worried that if this scandal were to reach the upper court, the officials could easily muck up the truth, add strokes where they shouldn't, and have Banue take all the blame while little Pei ran off scot-free. With Windmaster's sudden appearance, telling him not to get further involved, didn't this cement that they would protect little Pei? Without any change in expression, Shilian stepped forward to stand in front of Banue, hiding her behind him, and said warmly, But I'm already further involved, so telling me to leave it now is fairly pointless, no? The Windmaster flashed a smile. Don't worry, you can take the State Preceptor of Banue away with you. Now that was unexpected. Shilian was slightly taken aback, and the Windmaster continued. While you were all in the pit, we heard everything from up here. Although the State Preceptor had turned into a wrath, when I roamed the city, I saw that she had drawn the array to trap the Banue soldiers and release all the captured mortals. She didn't hurt anyone and even saved people. The only ones I'm taking are General Pei Jr. and Kamo. You don't have to worry about me placing undue blame on anyone. Shilian relaxed. Much ashamed. I was suspicious. It's normal to worry, the Windmaster said. There's certainly an unpleasant culture in the upper court, after all. The lady in black looked as if she couldn't stay for a moment longer and spoke up. Are you done? If you're done, let's go. The Windmaster rebutted. What's the rush? The more you rush, the more I want to talk. Still, she turned her head and smiled, taking a folding fan out from her waist. Your Royal Highness, if there's nothing else, we'll see you in the upper court? Shilian nodded, and the Windmaster opened her fan. On the fan was the word Feng, on a slant. Was the word for wind, Feng, on a slant, and 3 inclined lines like wind on the back. That had to be the Windmaster's spiritual device. She fanned forward 3 times and backward 3 times. Suddenly, a gust of wind blew from out of nowhere. The wind drew dust and sand, and Shilian raised his sleeve to block the debris. When the wind died down, the 2 ladies, Pei Shu and Kamo, had all disappeared, leaving behind only Shilian, Sanlang, Nanfeng, and the curled-up Banue on the ground. Shilian dropped his sleeve, still a little dazed. What just happened? Sanlang casually strolled over. A pretty good thing. Shilian looked at him. Is it? Yeah. The Windmaster was trying to help you by telling you not to get involved. Nanfeng walked over too. That's right. You've dug too deep into all this business already. The only thing left to do is file a complaint to the Heavenly Emperor. Don't get yourself any more involved. Shilian got it. Is it because of General Pei? Correct, Nanfeng said. This time you have thoroughly offended him. Shilian laughed. I knew I was going to offend someone one of these days. I guess it doesn't matter who. Nanfeng furrowed his brows. Don't think I'm joking. After the Palace of Divine Might, the next most powerful martial palace is Mingguang. General Pei thinks very highly of little Pei, and has long been trying to oust Kong Yizhen. He's gonna come knocking, looking for trouble. Kong Yizhen is the martial god that rules the West, right? Shilian asked. That's the one, Nanfeng replied. Kong Yizhen is also a new official. He ascended around the same time as Pei Shu. He's young and a little, but very powerful. General Pei intended for Pei Shu to take over all the devotees of the West, and he's done well for himself, especially in the past few years. Now with you dragging this scandal out into the open, it's not looking good for Pei Shu. Maybe he'll even be banished. If he gets banished, your luck is going to turn for the worse too. Shilian rubbed his forehead, mentally taking note that from now on he would have to be more mindful when eating, drinking, and walking. Sanlong, however, didn't think it was a big deal. Don't worry, Pei Ming is too proud. He won't do anything underhanded. Nanfeng gave him a look. What about the Windmaster? Shilian asked. She told me not to get involved, meaning she's the one who will file the complaint. In that case, wouldn't she become the one offending General Pei? I can't have that. Let's call back. Nanfeng, do you know the password to her personal communication array? You needn't worry about the Windmaster, Nanfeng said. General Pei can hurt you, but he won't touch her. She may be younger than you, but she's much more successful in the heavens. Shilian wasn't shocked into silence, but was instead thinking, who in the heavens is more of a failure than me? I don't think there's anyone. Sanlong laughed. With that backing, of course she's successful. Are you talking about the Lady in Black? She looks to be a strong character too, Shilian remarked. No, Sanlong replied, but she must also be one of the 5 elemental masters that make up wind, water, rain, earth, and thunder. I recommend not offending her. The Windmaster could start a twister from nowhere, which was obviously powerful, but the Lady in Black was stronger. Shilian kept thinking that the lady had noticed something in Sanlong and felt rather concerned. I agree. Still, there were words that Shilian thought didn't need to be said, so he swallowed them. Even someone with a strong backing may not be successful. But in this day, the Crown Prince of Shinla had the support of the Heavenly Emperor, who ruled all 3 realms for 1,000 years. He was still a failure. Shilian picked up his fallen bamboo hat, dusted it off, and sighed in relief upon seeing that it wasn't flattened. He tied it back around his neck and looked at Nanfeng. You weren't pursued and beaten up by those 2 ladies the whole time, were you? Yes, we fought the whole time, Nanfeng replied, face dark. Shilian patted his shoulders. Thanks for your hard work. Suddenly he remembered another hard worker and turned around. Where's Fu Yao? Wasn't he watching the Bitten Man? Nanfeng responded. Shilian didn't recall seeing Fu Yao after getting blown out of the Sinner's Pit. Actually, ever since Shao revealed himself, there had been no sign of him. If he didn't leave then, he must have left when the wind blew. Shilian wasn't actually that worried. He figured Fu Yao didn't want to get mixed up in this mess, and so he ran off. But having heard Nanfeng say bitten, he snapped out of it, and they both cried at the same time. The Shanyue Fern! The sky is only just lightening. No rush, Sanlong said. However, there was no such thing as no rush when it came to saving lives. Even if they were far from the 24-hour deadline, who knew if anything had happened in all this time? Shilian had no time to think about Fu Yao. He hurriedly lifted Banyue onto his back and ran toward the palace grounds. Once at the palace, Shilian laid Banyue down and immediately picked a few large bundles of the Shanyue fern. That mud face was still on the ground, its face a bloody mess among its white bones. In the past, Shilian would have buried it, but first of all, he was in a hurry to save people, and second, that man had been buried in the ground for 50 or 60 years. He must not want to go back. But the corpse of the dead merchant was missing, and Shilian stopped, puzzled. Just then, Sanlong emerged from the palace with a small clay pot. When Shilian saw, he immediately called out, Good, Sanlong, thank you. Banyue was weak, and they couldn't rouse her, so Shilian shrunk her and tucked her into the pot. With the ferns collected, the group rushed back. It had been about 8 hours since they left. Returning to where Fu Yao had drawn the circle, Shilian saw that many were still sitting properly within it, too scared to venture out. The old man who had taken Nanfeng's pill was doing all right, and after applying the herb to his wound and having him eat the plant, he was able to stand and walk after resting for a while. Shilian didn't think there was any need to tell them what the herb used to grow on. After some time, the merchants settled down, and they began to worry. Where's Jiansheng? Why haven't the others returned yet? Shilian had been too busy picking herbs to find him earlier, plus there was not a single Banyue soldier left in the ruins, so he hadn't bothered with Jiansheng and the others. He was just thinking about going back to search for them when he heard a voice of a boy yelling as he ran closer and closer. Shilian turned his head, and sure enough, it was Jiansheng. The boy had a large bundle of the Shanue fern in his arms, and behind him were 2 other merchants, all huffing and puffing. Shilian asked them what happened, and learned that while on top of the wall of the sinner's pit, Banyue swept the soldiers down and captured Tiancheng and the merchants. They were terrified, but Banyue only led them down from the pit, and directed them to where to go before setting them on their way. They escaped and picked the herbs and hurried back, buried the dead merchant's body, and rushed back as fast as they could. Yet they were still slower than Shilian. In any case, Shilian escorted the caravan out of the Gobi Desert and ended this journey at last. Before they bid farewell, Tiansheng snuck out to find him and whispered mysteriously, "Gaga, I have a question for you." "Ask away," Shilian said. "You're actually a god, aren't you?" Shilian was astonished, but also a little touched. In the past, there was a time when he'd holler and announce to the world, "I am a god! I am the Crown Prince, His Royal Highness!" And no one would believe him. This time, he hadn't even said anything, and the other party asked if he was a god. It made him both astonished and moved. Tiansheng asked immediately, "I saw you use spells. Don't worry, I won't tell." "How would you even tell? No one would believe you," Shilian thought. Tiansheng continued, "If not for you, I would have gotten thrown into that pit by that bunch of ugly ghost soldiers. When I get home, I'll build you a temple and worship you." Shilian watched him pat his chest and make very big hand gestures, and couldn't help but laugh. He smiled. "Then thank you." Sanlang was standing to the side, and he chuckled lightly for some unknown reason. Shilian didn't think it was because he thought the child's naive words were ridiculous. Although children had no idea how much work went into constructing a temple, receiving such a promise, whether it would be fulfilled or not, was nevertheless a happy occasion. After much hassling, he made up a random title, the Scrap Immortal, to leave behind. Then he waved and walked off to the opposite direction. Nyanfeng drew another teleportation array and sent them all back to Puqi Shrine. Once opening the door, Shilian took the straw mat out, laid it open on the ground, and collapsed on it like a dead body. This was done all in one breath. Sanlang sat down next to him and watched him, a hand propping up his chin. Shilian sighed. "How long were we gone?" "About 3-4 days," Sanlang replied. Shilian sighed again. "Only 3-4 days? Why am I so tired?" Ever since he ascended, he was worked to the bone like a dog. No lie. After he was done sighing, Shilian looked up. Nanfeng, why haven't you gone to report back yet?" "Report back where?" Nanfeng asked. "Aren't you an official of Penanyang Palace? Won't your general miss you after 3 or 4 days?" "My general isn't in the palace right now, so he won't miss me," Nanfeng replied. Shilian rolled over and got up. "All right. It'll be good, too, if you stay." "What are you doing?" Nanfeng asked. Shilian looked at him cheerfully. "I'm going to cook you a meal, as a reward for your hard work." Nanfeng's face dropped drastically. He raised his hand, pressed 2 fingers together, and touched his temple as if receiving someone's private communication. He got up and turned. "There's an emergency at the palace. I'll see you later." Shilian raised his hand. "What? Nanfeng, don't go. How can there suddenly be an emergency? I really want to thank you for everything." "There's an emergency," Nanfeng roared and ran out the door. Shilian sat back down on the mat and looked at Sanlang. "I guess he's not hungry." There was a loud bang before Sanlang could reply, and it was Nanfeng who'd run back, blocking the doorway. "You two!" Shilian and Sanlang were sitting together on the mat, and they both looked up at him. "What about us two?" Nanfeng pointed his finger at Sanlang, then at Shilian, words stuck in his throat, unable to speak. Then finally, "I'll be back." "You're welcome any time," Shilian said. Nanfeng gave Sanlang one last stink eye before closing the door and leaving. Shilian crossed his arms and tilted his head like Sanlang and said, "Looks like there really is an emergency." He turned to look at the youth next to him and smiled cheerfully. "He's not hungry. How about you?" Sanlang smiled cheerfully back. "I'm starving." Shilian grinned and stood up again, before turning around and casually tidying the altar table. "All right, then. What do you want to eat, Huacheng?" Behind him there was silence, then chuckling. "I still prefer the name Sanlang." And that's chapter 10.